The most famous UFO cases in history. Number 1. The Roswell Incident, 1947. I don't think it's possible to discuss the most famous UFO cases in history without bringing up the Roswell Incident. This is one of the, if not the most famous incident that we have to date. So before we discuss the significance of the Roswell Incident and a few different bizarre things that happened around it, let's directly discuss the case and what we know. In 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield receives a strange call and report from a police officer. This officer reports to the military that a flying saucer has crashed in a nearby ranch and he's unsure what to do with the materials. The military then quickly responds to the situation, and one of the individuals that's sent to the field to analyze and recover these debris is Officer Jesse Marcel. He is an intelligence officer from the military who's been very outspoken about the situation ever since. Before we get into exactly what Officer Marcel claims that he saw and held with his own hands, let's just discuss what happens then. The military issues a public announcement that they have recovered a flying saucer. There are then several news publications of the story, and it's pretty much what anybody in the entire country can talk about at that point. Not long after, the military quickly changes their story, and they walk back the claims of a flying saucer having crashed at a nearby ranch, and instead they claim it was a weather balloon. Because this case has become so famous, later in 1994, the US Congress launched an official investigation into the events that happened in 1947 in Roswell. And their conclusion was that this was in fact not a weather balloon, that was a cover-up story from the government themselves. The government did indeed later conclude that it was in fact a balloon, although it was not a weather balloon, it was an espionage balloon. This was the beginning of the Cold War, and the United States wanted to keep a close eye on the Soviet Union and their nuclear weapons development. So one of the things that they claimed that they did was Project Mogul, which involved a series of balloons that were deployed above Roswell that were intended to eventually monitor Russia. Think of something like the Chinese spy balloons that we had here in the United States not that long ago. Now, there are several interesting and curious things surrounding this case that are certainly worth mentioning, but we can't cover every single thing. Probably the most important thing to mention, however, are the accounts of Officer Marcel himself, the officer who recovered these debris. It's interesting that the man himself who recovered these findings and had the opportunity to study them with his own hands tells a very different story. Jesse Marcel was an intelligence officer for the United States Air Force at the time, and over the years he has gone on to give several interviews discussing this situation and his findings. Officer Marcel has been incredibly consistent with his story and confirms to us that in fact this was no weather balloon. This Air Force officer claims that the findings were of in fact a flying saucer that was certainly not from our military and not from this world. Before we exactly discuss what he describes that he saw and what he held, I think it's important to mention that he would have been somebody that understands different craft and equipment. This wasn't just the average enlisted soldier that might not have known of technology that maybe the government did in fact have. If anybody would have known what it was, he would have been one of them. Marcel describes the findings and the debris as lightweight but incredibly strong. He describes these parts that he recovered as thin metallic sheets that were extremely resistant. He also describes them as having some strange sort of memory. He noticed that some of the pieces of the material would return to their original shape when folded or crumbled. The other extremely fascinating thing that he mentions are unrecognizable writings and symbols on these metals. He claims that the wreckage had some sort of hieroglyphic-like language to it. It wasn't a foreign writing or anything like that, or hieroglyphs that we would see from Egypt with animals and things like that, but that the writings were in fact very geometrical in nature. He then claims multiple times on record that this was in fact a government cover-up, and that there was no weather balloon, and in fact it was not part of Project Mogul. He has then also gone on record multiple times stating that he does not believe that the materials were of human nature, and in fact his own son seems to back up this claim. His son claims to have seen and touched these materials himself when he was 11 years old. So how exactly did his own son have access to these materials and was able to see it himself? Well, the military officer himself claims that after the recovery of the objects, before going back to the Roswell Army Airfield, he stopped home first to share with his family his findings. At this time, Jesse Marcel Jr. was only 11 years old, but later recalled being woken up by his father in the middle of the night to look at the debris. His son also describes these materials the same way his father did. While incredibly light, also incredibly resistant, when bent one way, recovering its shape. Weird hieroglyphic-like writing, things that resembled structures, and were also very geometrical in nature. Some of these materials were only kept in the house for a short time before being taken back to the base for analysis. The materials were then reportedly transferred to the higher authorities, and the official weather balloon explanation followed soon after. So why did the military officer bring these materials to his home in the first place? It's almost very hard to believe that something so extraordinary would have been held by an 11-year-old child. Why were these not handled with more care and seriousness and immediately brought to a military base? That's one of the things that I would question. Marcel claims that this was done out of curiosity. He was fascinated by the findings and he wanted to share it with his family. There was also a lot of confusion around it. He didn't really understand what the findings were, and it's claimed that at this time there wasn't secrecy around this subject as there is now. This was all very new. This is one of the original cases. He wasn't exactly aware that there would be further scrutiny with this and a high level of secrecy later on. So of course, skeptics over the years have claimed that Officer Marcel was lying and this never actually happened, and that his son was also either lying or just remembering things because he was a child. With that said though, of course, anyone is capable of lying, but there is a level of credence that should be given to a military officer. Again, this wasn't an average Joe. This wasn't the average military private enlisted army soldier. This was a Air Force intelligence officer, somebody that's very high ranking. So as many have stated over the years, there is some level of respect that should be given to the officer, not only based on his position, but also why would he lie? He's also certainly not the only military officer or pilot or soldier in general to make similar claims of bizarre findings. And as a matter of fact, over the years, former military personnel have come forward claiming that they were involved in the handling of these strange materials also. Many of them have described being threatened or ordered to remain silent about this case and their involvement. What's also extremely bizarre of this case, as mentioned before, is that the initial reports of the military personnel on the ground recovering these materials was that it was a crashed flying saucer, that these were actual pieces of a UFO, not a balloon. As many people over the years have stated, soldiers, let alone military officers, would probably be able to recognize the difference between an aircraft and a weather balloon, or a flying saucer UFO versus a balloon. Regardless, this is one of the most famous UFO cases in history. Number 2. The Battle of Los Angeles, 1942. The Battle of Los Angeles was an incredibly bizarre case, and it's one of the most iconic UFO-related incidents in history. There are multiple reasons for this, which we will soon discuss, but the main one is a large-scale military response to an unidentified object, which resulted in over 1,400 rounds being deployed and even deaths. It's worth pointing out that this was a period of extremely high tension because it was following the attack on Pearl Harbor just a few months before this. Around 7 p.m. on February 24, 1942, a U.S. military radar detects an unidentified object about 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Air raid sirens were sounded and a citywide blackout was ordered in preparation to what the military believed was an attack from the Japanese. At around 3:15 a.m., so about an hour after, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on an unidentified target spotted in the sky. Soldiers fired more than 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition into the air. Witnesses reported seeing strange, slow-moving objects illuminated by searchlights, and these objects appeared to be immune to gunfire. By 4:15 a.m., so an entire hour after, the all-clear signal was given and the blackout ended. No bombs were dropped, and no enemy planes were recovered or even confirmed to exist. There was property damage across the city from falling shell fragments from the artillery fire, and at least 5 deaths were reported, 3 of them from heart attacks and 2 from car accidents during the chaos. Also, soldiers operating the searchlights and anti-aircraft guns claimed to have seen a large dark object that seemed unaffected by their bombardment. Some military personnel insisted it was an enemy aircraft or a fleet of aircraft, while others were baffled by the object's behavior and lack of damage received. So what is the government's official statement as to what happened that day? Well, they've actually never been able to confirm it, they've only come up with theories. The first one of those theories was war hysteria. The US War Department initially suggested that the event was caused by war nerves and an overreaction to a possible false alarm. During this time and leading up to this event, tensions were already very high as a Japanese submarine had attacked an oil refinery near Santa Barbara just days earlier. The second government theory, which we see in this case once again, much like the Roswell incident, was the weather balloon theory. Later, the Army then claimed that the quote-unquote enemy was likely a weather balloon that had been misidentified and exaggerated in the middle of the chaos. The glowing appearance of the object could have been caused by artillery explosions reflecting off of the balloon. Some speculated that it was an actual Japanese reconnaissance mission. However, Japanese military officials later denied any involvement, and no evidence of enemy planes was ever found. What's interesting about this case is that unlike the Roswell incident where there was an actual recovery of an aircraft or of a weather balloon, in this case, no objects or aircraft were ever recovered and in fact were never confirmed to have ever been there in the first place. Seemingly the military just fired over 1,400 rounds into the sky at no real target. What's also interesting about this case is that there is photographic evidence. A famous photograph was taken during this event. It shows searchlights covering on an object in the sky, with anti-aircraft bursts visible all around it. Some claim that this photograph is of a UFO, while skeptics argue that it's a result of overexposure and editing. So some believe that it was a reflection from the light, overexposure from the camera, and other people believe that the photo has been edited or altered altogether, even though this was back in the 40s. What then followed was a declassification of documents. In the years following, declassified military documents revealed conflicting opinions amongst military officials. Some believed the incident was due to nervousness and an overreaction, while others maintained it was an unexplained aerial event. Some skeptics argued that the glowing objects were likely flares or weather balloons, and the chaotic firing was a result of tension and poor communication. What's interesting about the weather balloon theory, again, is that no aircraft or balloons or objects were ever recovered, other than the fragments from the shells of the artillery fire that completely destroyed the city. Regardless, this has become one of the most famous UFO incidents in history that we know of. Number 3. The Foo Fighters. The Foo Fighters refers to a series of cases spotted by pilots during World War II. The Foo Fighters were a series of cases that refer to a series of unexplained aerial phenomena reported by Allied aircraft pilots during World War II. These sightings remain one of the earliest and most intriguing examples of unidentified flying objects being reported by credible observers such as military pilots and personnel. The term Foo Fighter was coined by Allied pilots who were mostly the ones observing this phenomena. Most of these reports come from US pilots, but it's worth noting that there were other Allied pilots from other countries who also reported on this. And later on, even Axis pilots, such as the Germans, also confirmed observing this same phenomena. The Foo Fighters were described as bright glowing objects, often red, orange, or white in color. These objects displayed unusual flight characteristics, such as high-speed maneuvers, sudden acceleration and decelerations, the ability to hover or stay stationary mid-air, evasive maneuvers avoiding collisions with aircraft. Generally speaking, things that aircraft of that time weren't capable of doing. The sightings began in 1944 and were primarily reported again by US pilots flying over Europe, the Pacific, and Asia. The majority of reports came from pilots in the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces who encountered the Foo Fighters during bombing runs and reconnaissance missions. The size seemed to vary, but most were small, being compared to a basketball or a beach ball. Foo Fighters were described to appear suddenly, often in high altitudes, and trail aircraft. Pilots reported that these objects seemed to intelligently react to their maneuvers but didn't really display any hostility. They would also vanish just as suddenly as they appeared. Although, as mentioned, no hostility seemed to ever be displayed, there are mentions and reports of aircraft failure during this phenomena. Despite their unsettling presence, the Foo Fighters never really attacked or interfered with Allied aircraft operations. Now, like any UFO incident or report, there are theories surrounding this case as well. Many Allied pilots suspected that the Foo Fighters were advanced German technology, such as experimental aircraft or anti-aircraft weaponry. However, no concrete evidence of such technology was ever found. Also, after the war ended, Axis pilots also admitted being in the presence of the same type of phenomena, which discards the theory of it being an enemy weapon. The other theory was that these were Japanese balloon bombs. Sometimes the Foo Fighters were theorized to be Japanese incendiary balloons, but their flight patterns and behaviors just didn't match this explanation either. The other line of theory is natural phenomena, the first one being ball lightning. A ball lightning is a weather-related phenomenon involving glowing spheres of electricity. With that said, ball lightning is rare and it doesn't fully explain the Foo Fighters' behavior or flight patterns and maneuvers. Another theory is that these were St. Elmo's fire. This is an electrical phenomenon that sometimes appears on aircraft. But this also doesn't account for the speed and intelligent maneuverability that was displayed and reported. Some skeptics argued that the sightings were due to pilot fatigue, stress, or war nerves, leading to hallucinations and misinterpretations of ordinary phenomena. Of course, the final theory and hypothesis is that these could have been UFOs. Many UFO researchers believe that the Foo Fighters were evidence of extraterrestrial surveillance or reconnaissance, especially due to their seemingly intelligent behavior. So why is this case so significant? Well, number one, it's one of the earliest accounts of UFOs that we have recorded in history. These were not average soldiers reporting these. These were pilots and crew members that were specifically trained observers with experience in aircraft. These reports carry weight due to their credibility and consistency. Also, there is military documentation of these events. Foo Fighter reports were taken seriously by the military officials and intelligence agencies at the time that they were received. Files on the phenomenon were compiled, although no definitive explanation was ever reached. With that said, the Foo Fighters case remains one of the most compelling UFO phenomena ever recorded due to the credibility of the witnesses, the military documentation, and the enduring mystery. Number 4. The Varginha Incident, 1996. Now, I wouldn't be doing my home country, Brazil, any justice if I didn't talk about this case. The Varginha Incident is the most famous UFO case in Brazil. This incident has a number of witnesses with varying levels of involvement and credibility. Estimates suggest that there were 20 to 30 witnesses who either directly or indirectly reported seeing or interacting with these events. Now, before we get into this case, I think it's worth mentioning that there is a lot surrounding this case. There is probably 10 hours worth of documentation and things that we could go over and different witnesses and accounts. For the purposes of this video though, I will try to be as direct as possible because the story is pretty wild. This event occurred in January 1996 in the town of Varginha, Brazil. The case starts with an initial UFO sighting, where local residents reported seeing a cigar-shaped UFO flying erratically and eventually crashing near the city. The case starts with an initial UFO sighting, where local residents reported seeing a cigar-shaped UFO flying erratically and eventually crashing near the city. Days later, 3 young women by the names of Liliane, Valkyria, and Katia encountered a strange being in an empty lot. They described the being as following: brown oily skin, a thin humanoid body, large red eyes, and finally, 3 bony protrusions on its head. The girls reported feeling overwhelming fear and described the creature as weak or injured. Following this, there is a high level of military involvement. Witnesses claimed that the Brazilian military and local fire department were involved in recovering the creature and possibly others. Rumors circulated that at least one of the beings was alive and taken to a nearby medical facility before being transferred to a military base. Rumors then circulated that at least one of the beings was alive and taken to a nearby medical facility before being transferred to a military base. Several locals reported seeing military personnel barricading off areas and transporting strange materials. Then, this is one of the most interesting parts of this case, there is a mysterious death. A military officer that was involved in handling the creature reportedly died under suspicious circumstances. This was due to an infection that couldn't be explained or treated by medical professionals, which further fueled the speculation of an extraterrestrial contamination. At some point after the hospitalization of the creature, the US government and military gets involved, and that's when the trail goes cold and we don't know anything else about the case. Believers consider this undeniable evidence of alien visitation, citing consistent eyewitness testimonies and extremely unusual military activity and involvement. However, skeptics argued that it was a combination of misidentifications, hoaxes, and hysteria, with some suggesting that the quote-unquote alien was a deformed or sick animal, or possibly even a homeless person. With all that said, the Varginha case remains one of the most intriguing UFO stories. And I think it's also worth mentioning that a cinematographer took interest in this story and did further investigation in a documentary on this. This same cinematographer also appeared on Joe Rogan and further discusses this case with Joe himself. Number 5. Bob Lazar, 1989. I don't think we could talk about the most famous UFO cases in history if we didn't talk about Bob Lazar's story. Now, just like every other case mentioned in this video, there is a plethora of information surrounding this case, way more than I would ever be able to cover, and on this case, way more than any of the others, probably 10 hours worth of discussion plus. The Bob Lazar case, although extremely fascinating, is also extremely complex and involves many nuances and many things that I won't be able to cover all in this video. I'm going to try my best to be as straightforward as I can with this case, but if you're interested and you would like to do your own research, there is a lot more to it that I just don't have time to mention. So the Bob Lazar story is one of the most controversial and widely discussed stories in all of the UFO lore. Robert Scott Lazar was a physicist and an engineer who claims to have worked in the facility known as S4 near Area 51 in the late 1980s. This is where Bob Lazar alleges to have worked on reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. While his claims are often met with a lot of skepticism, he's been incredibly consistent with his story, and he is very clearly a very intelligent guy, as we will discuss. So Bob Lazar first came forward with this information in 1989 in an interview with the journalist George Knapp. So before we get into this story and case, let's first do a quick overview of Bob Lazar's background, education, and qualifications. Bob Lazar is allegedly a physicist and an engineer who graduated from MIT. Although Bob Lazar was very obviously an incredibly intelligent guy, he was also a pretty wild man. When he was younger, he got a little bit of fame by appearing on a local newspaper by being the guy that attached an airplane turbine on a Honda. He would take this jet car that he built in his own garage and go shoot guns in the desert. That's the kind of guy that Bob Lazar was, somewhere between a genius and a wild man. Bob Lazar claims to have been approached and recruited by government officials and military personnel to work on a top-secret government project. This project and research that he was assigned to would take place on a hidden military base known as S4, which was a facility near Area 51 in Nevada. It wasn't until Bob Lazar came forward with his story in 1989 that Area 51 became famous as the government alien research facility. So what are the most important things that Bob Lazar observed and worked on during his time at the S4 facility? Well, number one and most important is that Bob Lazar claims that he was assigned to reverse engineer a component of a recovered spacecraft that had crashed. He claims to have specifically worked on the propulsion system of the ship. And he explains that multiple different scientists and colleagues were assigned to work on different parts of the ship. He seems to resent this and explains that this made the research very difficult. He explains that by only having access to part of the components of this aircraft, he wasn't able to understand how the entire aircraft worked, and it made his research significantly more difficult. He believes that the military and the government didn't want any one person knowing too much. So for security reasons, they divided the tasks and the components so that not all knowledge was concentrated in one person and they didn't have access to the whole picture. What's also interesting about this case is once Bob Lazar comes public with this story, he mentions the discovery of element 115. Theoretically, element 115 was the component that was crucial to the function of this propulsion system. He claimed that this element had properties that we didn't quite fully understand at that time, and what's very important to note is that he brought this information forward in 1889, and later the discovery of this element was confirmed in 2003. The element was then called moscovium, but it's important to mention that moscovium is not as stable in the way that Bob Lazar describes. The way that he described element 115 or moscovium was a much more stable version than what we know now. Perhaps that might be because we don't fully understand how the element works just yet, or we don't know how to stabilize it, whereas the propulsion system already had that element integrated into it in a stable form. That is the claim. Although he wasn't able to work on the entire craft, he did get the opportunity to see it. And Bob describes the craft as smooth and metallic, resembling a classic flying saucer. Now, here is where a lot of the skepticism comes in and a lot of weirdness that happens in Bob's life after he comes out with this information and makes it public. So skeptics claim that Bob Lazar is lying and that he never worked near Area 51 because there is no official documentation proving that. They also claim that he is faking his credentials because there is no record of him ever graduating or attending MIT. Although there are individuals who claim to have gone to class with him, who claim to have known that he was a student there. Bob Lazar claims that ever since he made this information public, he's been pursued and harassed by the US government. And as a matter of fact, he continues to talk about these things as a form of protection. While many critics of Lazar say that he's doing this for fame and money, he says that this completely destroyed his life, and that the only reason that he continues to talk about it is to protect himself in case he goes missing or something happens. We know why. He believes that by making the case as high a profile as possible, it's less danger to his life. It's less likely that they will come after him in a public way. Lazar claims that the US government actively suppresses knowledge of extraterrestrial technology and harasses individuals who speak out. He alleges that his records of employment and education were erased to discredit him, allegedly an attempt to smear him and make him out to be a fraud. What's interesting about Lazar's story also is that all his accounts and interviews, which have been multiple, are extremely consistent and they don't change. Also again, that he discovered an element and made it public in the 80s when it wasn't really discovered and made public until 2003. Lazar spoke about Area 51 and its secretive operations before the US government officially ever acknowledged that the base existed in 2013. Another interesting detail that Bob Lazar describes of the facility S4 is a security device that was used to essentially authenticate and let people into the facility. He described that the facility used a unique biometric security system, which involved a handprint scanning technology. This detail is often cited as another example of Lazar's credibility, as the technology he described in the late 80s was obscure at the time but later became publicly known. The security system he described was a hand geometry scanner that measured the length and shape of the bones in the hand. Again, when Lazar brought this up and described it in the late 80s, it was an obscure technology that very few people had ever heard of. At the time, it really sounded like science fiction to most people. Years later, however, photos of a similar device surfaced, known as the Identimat. The Identimat was used for security purposes in some military and high-security installations, so it did in fact exist. So what exactly happens to Bob after he comes public with all this information in the late 80s? Well, Bob claims that the government started a relentless pursuit in trying to silence, harass, and even kill him. Lazar has alleged that government agents made attempts to intimidate him into silence both before and after he went public in '89. He claims that he was followed by unmarked vehicles and that his phone was tapped after he began speaking about his work at S4. Bob Lazar once claimed that he was shot at while driving. He suggested that this was an incident that was orchestrated by the government to intimidate him or potentially eliminate him as a threat. The details of this alleged incident remain vague and unverified, but it contributes to the narrative of a government cover-up. Lazar claims that the government erased all official records of his employment at S4 and all his academic credentials from MIT and Caltech, meaning that all proof that he actually went to college and that he was in fact a credible engineer and physicist were gone. No records have been found of his employment at the S4 facility or his academic achievements, although some co-workers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory reportedly do remember him. There was then the raid on his business incident. In 2017, Lazar's company, United Nuclear Scientific Equipment, was raided by the FBI and local law enforcement. The situation and incident did in fact happen, and there is an official statement and reason why this was done. The claimed official reason for the raid was related to hazardous material, but Lazar has suggested that it was a cover-up for searching for element 115. Lazar has suggested that this was a cover for searching for element 115, the alleged extraterrestrial substance he claims to have worked on during his time at S4. Lazar believes that this is another attempt to intimidate him or retrieve evidence that he might have kept. Lazar has stated that people close to him were also targeted, including his friends and former coworkers. He alleged that some of these individuals were warned not to speak publicly about what they knew or had witnessed. Lazar consistently claimed that he was concerned for his safety after going public, as he believed that the government would go to great lengths to protect the secrecy of alien technology, quote-unquote. In interviews, he has stated multiple times that he felt that by making his story public was the only way to protect himself, reasoning that if he became too visible, harming him would draw more attention to his claims. Like I had mentioned before, essentially, if he goes missing, we all know why. What's interesting about this story also is witnesses and testimony. Lazar's claims of erased records are intriguing because certain coworkers at Los Alamos remember him and mention working with him, even though official records do not list him as an employee. The government has never officially addressed Lazar's allegation of harassment, leaving the claims unresolved. Now, there is a lot more that I could say about Lazar's story. There is so much more to this case that probably would make this a 10-hour video. So if you're interested in Lazar's story, the information is out there. And as a matter of fact, he's been a guest on Joe Rogan and recounts his story there also. But for all these reasons, Bob Lazar's story is one of the most interesting stories in UFO lore ever. So here's one thing that I would like to share with you guys about the recording of this video before we wrap up. What you're looking at here is about 8 hours of work, and not because this is some masterpiece that I spent 8 hours editing. It's because I had to re-record and redo pretty much every section of this entire video at least 3 or 4 times. I'm going to show to you guys here in just a second what happened to pretty much all of my original recordings for this video. Now listen, I'm not claiming that this is like the government trying to stop me from talking about aliens or something like that. I'm not claiming, there's obviously some sort of conventional explanation for why this happened repeatedly, right? I'm sure. I try to live in reality. I don't think that the government's after me or anything like that. I don't think that, they're actively monitoring people talking about aliens or anything like that, but it's strange. So because it's within the topic of this video, I figured I'd just share, if anything, for entertainment purposes, but this did actually happen. In a minute, I'm going to share the recordings with you, but what ended up happening is I started getting some very heavy interference in my recordings. After hours of recording, at different sections of this video, I started getting random interference sounds that completely destroyed my recordings. Like, nobody would want to watch this video if it was that bad type of thing. So I had to redo everything. This happened around 1 in the morning last night. I actually posted about it on my community tab, and the rest of this video had to be recorded from another room. So you will notice that the reason why the quality of this video is not as good as other videos that I've done previously is because I couldn't use a pop filter for this video for whatever reason. I'm using the same exact microphone that I have always used in all my videos starting here from a certain point about 2 months ago or so, and I've never had this problem with it ever before. What I had to do was I had to get the cord that connects to the microphone in the computer and drag it all the way to another room. So because of that, I ended up having to record this video differently than what I normally do, which is in my office with a pop filter in front of my mouth. I had to sit on my bed and record with the microphone in my hands while I did it. Because for some reason, while I was recording here last night around 1:30 a.m., all my recordings kept getting repeatedly destroyed by some random frequency that I have no idea what's causing it. Now, again, I know that there's a conventional explanation for this. I'm not claiming it's the government or aliens or whatever. I'm just saying it's interesting. It's an interesting factoid that I figured I'd mention to you and I'd show you what the recordings were sounding like. And in fact, right now, I'm in that same office with the same exact setup and I'm not having this frequency issue anymore. So make of that what you will. Here are some of my original recordings and what ended up happening to them. Just a few of them just to give you some examples, but all of them, they were entirely destroyed pretty much every 3 seconds. Although some say that they would often interfere with aircraft communications and radar systems. So what exactly does Bob Lazar claim to have seen and worked on during his time at the S4 facility? Many Allied pilots suspected that the Foo Fighters were advanced German technology such as experimental aircraft or anti-aircraft weaponry. Local residents of that town reported seeing a cigar-shaped UFO flying erratically and eventually crashing near the city. The girls reported feeling overwhelmed with fear and described the creature as weak or injured, so it appears that this guy was talking about the discovery of an element that was not public information yet, an element that didn't really exist. The details, however, of this alleged incident remain vague. Number one, he alleges that government agents made attempts to intimidate him into silence both before and after he went public in 1989. This raid did in fact happen, and the official reason for the raid was related to hazardous materials. He claims that this security entry device was a device that measured the length and shape of the bones in the hand. And these are the most famous UFO cases ever recorded. Now, worth mentioning that there are many more cases that simply do not fit in this video because there's just too many. These are the ones that are most often discussed and are the ones that I'm the most familiar with and have heard about the most. There are certainly, however, many other stories that deserve to be in this video that I am also aware of. Unfortunately, if I were to include every single story in this video, it would be 10 hours long, but there are other stories like Commander Fravor's story, who's also been on Joe Rogan, who was also a military pilot and is famous for the Tic Tac story. This is an account from a commander pilot in the military that accounts for having seen unidentified Tic Tac objects that immersed in and out of the water. He actually chased down these objects, gave formal accounts of this, and there is actually radar proof that this did in fact happen, but it was blamed on malfunction. I would certainly be happy in doing a part 2 and actually covering these stories because they do have merit and I think that they should be shared also, but for now I'll leave the video right here. If you're still here with me and you watched this video till the very end, I thank you for your time. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to leave me a like, and if you want to see more videos like this or check out the other stuff that I do, don't forget to also subscribe. Once again, thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a great weekend.